Hi, everyone. So I'm going to discuss some enabling frameworks, and my approach would be to cite some examples being taken by various governments and businesses, um, hoping that it will spur ideas on what kinds of laws may be needed as temporary measures and long-term measures. So I'd like to show first our our website on the next slide. This is where this is a portal on the COVID-19. So we're starting to track government responses and business responses um, to the outbreak, hoping that voluntary effort will also spur the development of enabling legal environments. Next slide. I'd like to focus on the possibility of, well, the imminent mass unemployment and leave without pay, and also focusing on informal workers and casual workers. Just a brief overview in the next slide. I think we are all aware that the dangers usually threefold among many others. Informal and casual workers have no security of tenure. They're the first to go, and we are already seeing this all over the region. Many times they're often invisible in legal frameworks and social protection, and I'm going to give you some examples later on in my talk. And the third one is we're very conscious of this, even if they are part of the supply chain, specifically agriculture supply chain. In most cases, they remain to be unrecognized or unseen when we talk about legal rights. Next slide. So we're talking about how countries are responding. And so I'm going to go through each of these bullet points. So for example, we spoke about in the first presentation about trying to support sustainable industries so that they can also in turn support their workers. So in Cambodia, they're now starting to give to have a dialogue on tax exemptions for certain factories, and this would be a big help. I have not seen this, for example, in the Philippines. It has not been talked about yet. There's also ongoing negotiations of providing training for laid off workers and $1,020 a month allowance for the period of the quarantine in Cambodia. There are also some very few locators of economic zones in the Philippines that have shifted their production from the usual garments or semiconductors, and now they are producing PPEs. And yes, there's unemployment compensation for those registered under the Social Security Fund in Thailand, and some level of social amelioration program and subsidies in various countries in the region. I'd like to point out, for example, in the Philippines, we're already seeing a lot of cracks in the program. So it covers it covers informal sector workers, but because there's an absence of database for many kinds of informal sector workers, the decision on whether or not they should receive the fund subsidy has largely become very discretionary. There's also support for workers in the formal sector. First, it was much wider in scope. It covers any type of business, but the government suddenly suspended it and said that they have run out of funds and that they're shifting the funds to support for small businesses. But immediately we're seeing the problem. One ecozone locator that we're working with closely now immediately pointed out that they will be disqualified by the guidelines or the legal framework because they are a 17,000 strong industry, and if the support is only given to small businesses, then immediately they will be disqualified. Another one, in the Philippines, there's also a qualification that the company should be something like a company in good standing in terms of payment of taxes and social security benefits, and this will automatically remove so many companies. So it's like the sin of the company suddenly tragically disqualifies their workers, even if the workers have no fault at all. So these kinds of amelioration programs or support subsidies should be looked closely when we look at more long-term legal frameworks. Next slide. Last year, we released the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We started looking out at various litigation of cases in the gig economy. So Uber, Grab, those kinds of companies. And the report clearly states that there is a leaning towards this gig economy because it would cost companies about an average of 20% to 30% more to classify drivers as regular employees. That's data from the north, and probably it would be bigger if we're talking about ASEAN. Next slide, please. So what are the approaches and the recommendations for now? I was struck by the statement in the first presentation that now is not the time for labor reform, but now is the time for temporary measures, and also an opportunity to advocate um, for things that we have advocated for a long time. So, for example, for gig workers, um, hoping that legislative recommendations will adopt a presumption in favor of employee status. If the government is not ready to classify them now as employees, at the very least for purposes of support and subsidy, they should be considered as employees so that they will have the same rights and protections as regular workers. We are aware, for example, in many hospitals, for example, housekeeping workers, some of them are regular employees, others are through agencies, and we are aware that though the workers from the agencies often are not given PPEs on the assertion that they are not the employees of the hospital, so they are largely dependent on private donations. Next slide. There are many actions on the part of businesses, and these voluntary actions should be looked at to see if there's a way to support this and make it mandatory. So, for example, companies like Grab, Gojek, they have also given rental waivers for their drivers, so their daily rents are reduced 55 to 100% depending on the company. For example, in the Philippines, there are waivers, but this applies usually to payment of credit cards, residential rentals, might not affect the most vulnerable in the community, but something as simple as rental waivers would already benefit so many drivers in the public transport sector. There's also, of course, the financial aid to drivers, not only in the Philippines but in other countries in the region also. That should be supported, or at the very least looked at very closely on how the government can sustain that. And of course, there's the call around the world for hazard pays, regardless of the employee status of the worker in the company. So these are some of the calls of businesses, and from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center also, we're calling on to the big multinationals to honor their contracts and not to use COVID-19 as defense, and for them to claim that they're no longer going to honor their contractual commitments, for example, buying garments from their suppliers in Cambodia and Vietnam on the ground of fortuitous events. So there have been companies, for example, H&M, that has gone public and in saying that we commit to honor our our contracts with our suppliers. Next slide. Some of our initial asks as an organization are in these two essays, and I just want to also make a closing statement, and that we should all clearly look at also our human rights defenders legal framework. In ASEAN, there's only actually one country that defines very clearly what a human rights defender is, and I think and we assert that it's about time that we strongly advocate for strongly advocate for legal mechanisms to protect them, especially for the long-term effects and impact of COVID-19. Thanks.